The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Helen Crawford appeared at the gate of Homer Ellsworth's ranch, and every soul in Dusty Creek, Texas would later say they had never seen a woman stand so straight while carrying so much sorrow on her shoulders. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle had turned cruel early that year. The rains came in like a punishment from heaven, flooding the low roads and turning the red clay earth into something that sucked at boots and wagon wheels with equal indifference. Homer Ellsworth had spent most of that particular Wednesday afternoon mending a split rail in his fence line, working with the stubborn determination of a man who had nothing waiting for him inside his house, and therefore no reason to hurry back to it. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men who work land for a living tend to be, with dark eyes that held something quiet and watchful behind them. He had owned the Ellsworth Ranch for 6 years, having purchased it with money saved from cattle drives up the Kisham Trail, and he had worked every acre of it himself with only the help of 2 hired hands, a weathered Mexican cowboy named Rodrigo, and a young man from Arkansas named Bo who could fix nearly anything mechanical, but talked so little that Homer sometimes forgot he was there. Homer had never married. This was not for lack of opportunity, as the women of Dusty Creek had made their interest known in various polite and not so polite ways over the years. He was considered a good prospect by any reasonable measure. He simply had not found the particular thing he was looking for, though he would have struggled to say precisely what that thing was. He knew it was not just companionship, and it was not just beauty, and it was not just the practical arrangement that many ranch marriages amounted to in those years. He wanted something he could not name, and so he had gone on waiting without quite knowing he was doing it. He was still at the fence when he saw them coming up the road. There were 7 of them, which was the first thing he noticed. A woman and 6 children moving through the rain in a loose cluster, the way a hen moves with her chicks. The woman was leading a mule that looked as exhausted as anything Homer had ever seen, and the mule was pulling a wagon so old and battered that its left rear wheel was held on by what appeared to be a length of wire and a prayer. 2 of the children were walking alongside the wagon. 2 more were riding in the bed of it, small heads visible above the warped wooden slats. And the woman herself was walking through the mud with her head up, her dark hair plastered flat against her face by the rain, her coat so soaked through that it must have weighed as much as a saddle blanket. Homer set down his hammer and walked to the gate. She stopped when she saw him, and for just a moment something flickered across her face that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but some combination of the two that lived in the space between them. She was younger than the weight of her circumstances made her seem, perhaps 30 or 31, with dark eyes that were set in a face that was striking even through the mud and the exhaustion. Her jaw was set with a kind of fierce dignity that Homer recognized instinctively as the look of someone who has been proud all their life and has recently been forced to consider whether pride is a luxury they can still afford. "I am sorry to bother you," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised him. "I am Helen Crawford. My wagon wheel is failing and I have 6 children, and I was told in town that you were a man who might help." Homer opened his gate without a word. He did not hesitate once. "Come on through," he said. "Let's get those children out of the rain." She looked at him for a moment as if she was trying to determine whether he was real, whether kindness of this uncomplicated kind was something that still existed in the world. Then she clicked her tongue at the mule and guided it through the gate, and the whole ragged procession came up the muddy track toward the house. The children ranged in age from what appeared to be about 3 years old to perhaps 14. Homer counted them as they came through. A tall, serious-looking boy of about 14 who walked with his shoulders squared like he was already practicing to be the man of something. A girl of perhaps 12 with her mother's dark eyes and a protective arm around a smaller child. 2 boys who looked to be around 9 and 7, close enough in height and coloring that they might have been twins but were probably not. a girl of about 5 who was being carried by the older girl, and the smallest, a round-cheeked child of 3 or thereabouts who was sitting in the wagon bed with a rag doll pressed against her chest, watching Homer with enormous eyes that showed no fear whatsoever. Homer pushed open the door of his house and called out for Rodrigo, who materialized from the direction of the barn with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had seen enough of life's complications to take them in stride. "Get the fire going in the kitchen," Homer said, "and put the kettle on." Rodrigo looked at the woman and the 6 children and nodded once, without expression, and went to do it. Homer's house was not a fine house, but it was solid and dry, and it had a large kitchen with a fireplace that could heat the whole front half of the building when it was going properly. He brought them in, herding them gently toward the warmth, and he found dry blankets from the chest at the foot of his bed and passed them around without being asked. The children huddled near the fire with the pragmatic gratitude of people who were cold and were now being offered warmth, and even the oldest boy, the serious one, allowed himself to fold his long arms around the blanket Homer gave him. Helen Crawford stood in the middle of his kitchen with water dripping from the hem of her coat and pooling on his floorboards, and she looked around the room with an expression that Homer could not quite read. It was not the look of a woman casing a place. It was the look of a woman reminding herself that she was still capable of accepting help. "Thank you," she said, and she said it simply, without the excess of gratitude that sometimes made generosity feel transactional. "I did not know if anyone would." "There is coffee," Homer said, "and I can have Bo look at that wheel before dark." She nodded. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly, though her face gave nothing away. He poured the coffee himself and brought it to her, and she wrapped both hands around the tin cup and closed her eyes for just a moment. It was such a small, private gesture of relief that Homer felt he had witnessed something he was not entirely meant to see, and he looked away to give her what privacy he could. The children, with the extraordinary resilience that children possess, had already begun to adjust. The 2 middle boys were examining every corner of the kitchen with bright, roving eyes. The younger girl, the 5-year-old, had unwound herself from her sister's arm and was standing near the fireplace with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape, looking regal and satisfied. The smallest child had climbed down from somewhere and was sitting on the floor, still holding her rag doll, watching the fire with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who had no reason yet to complicate anything. "What are their names?" Homer asked. Helen turned from the fire and looked at them with an expression that was at once exhausted and so full of love it was almost painful to witness. "The oldest is James," she said. "Then Martha. Then Thomas and William, they are 9 and 7. And that is Clara by the fire, she is 5. And the little one is Rose, she just turned 3 in August." "Fine names," Homer said. "My husband chose them." She said it without inflection, but Homer heard the past tense clearly and he did not press it. Bo appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently materialized from wherever he spent his time, and Homer sent him out to look at the wagon wheel. Helen started to get up to go with him, with the reflex of a woman who had learned to manage her own problems, and Homer said quietly, "Let him look at it. He is better with wheels than most men are with their own hands. Drink your coffee." She sat back down, and there was something in that small capitulation, the willingness to let someone else carry something for just a moment, that seemed to cost her, and also to relieve her. They sat in the warmth of the kitchen while the rain hammered at the roof, and after a few minutes the children, warmed and fed on the biscuits Rodrigo produced with mysterious efficiency, began to grow drowsy in the way that small animals do when they have been cold and are suddenly warm. The 3-year-old Rose crawled up onto the bench beside her mother and put her head in Helen's lap with the certainty of a child who has never doubted her mother's presence. And Helen put her hand on the child's damp curls and stroked them automatically, still holding her coffee cup in the other hand. Homer watched this from across the table and felt something shift in his chest, quiet and fundamental, like the first crack in river ice at the end of winter. He asked, carefully, where they were headed. Helen told him the story in the straightforward way of someone who has already told it enough times to have stripped it of any unnecessary emotion. Her husband, Daniel Crawford, had been a rancher in Kansas. He had died of a fever the previous spring, leaving debts that the bank had been politely but implacably disinterested in discussing. The land had gone to the bank. The house had gone to the bank. Most of what was in the house had gone to pay what the land and house did not cover. She had a sister in a town called Morrow, which was another 40 miles southwest, and the sister had a husband who had agreed, somewhat reluctantly from what Helen's tone implied, to take them in until Helen could find some way to establish herself. "You have been traveling 40 miles in this weather," Homer said. "More than that," she said. "The roads curved me around when the flooding started. I reckon I have been on the road since Monday morning." This was Wednesday evening. Homer did his arithmetic quietly and felt the weight of those 3 days settle over him. 3 days on the road with 6 children, in the rain, in a wagon with a failing wheel. "You will stay tonight," he said. It was not phrased as an offer. It came out as a statement, and he realized as he said it that it was and that he meant it completely. She looked at him with those dark eyes measuring something. "I do not want to impose. The road tomorrow is flooded past the Caldwell Creek crossing," he said. "I was through there this morning. You cannot cross it tonight or tomorrow morning. That is just the fact of it, and it has nothing to do with imposing." She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked down at the sleeping 3-year-old in her lap, and she said, "All right. Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth." "Homer," he said. She looked up. "Homer," she said, and the way she said it, careful and quiet, as if she was placing it somewhere safe, did something to him that he could not have articulated but that he did not try to ignore. He gave her his room and made a bed of blankets near the kitchen fire for the smaller children, and the older ones slept in the loft that Rodrigo normally used, Rodrigo having cheerfully relocated himself to the barn. Homer himself slept in the chair by the front window, which was not comfortable but which he had slept in before, and which gave him a view of the night sky when the rain thinned briefly around 2 in the morning, showing a strip of cold stars before the clouds moved back in. He lay in the chair and stared at the ceiling and thought about the woman sleeping in his room, and the 6 children sleeping in his house, and the feeling that had settled into his chest when she said his name, and he could not tell if it was foolish or true. He had been alone long enough that he no longer always trusted his own instincts about such things. He had built a life around solitude the way a man sometimes builds a fence around a piece of land he is not certain he wants to keep, but does not want anyone else to have either. In the morning the rain was still falling, though softer now, and Homer was up before anyone else and had the stove going and coffee on. He was standing at the window with his cup when he heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to find the oldest boy, James, standing in the kitchen doorway. The boy was fully dressed, his face carrying the cautious look of someone who does not know yet what kind of household this is. "Good morning," Homer said. "Good morning, sir," James said. "Coffee." The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "I do not usually drink it." "Smart," Homer said. "It stunts things, they say. You want to eat something." James came into the kitchen with the careful movements of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible, and he sat at the table and accepted the cornbread Homer put in front of him. They ate together for a few minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "How long have you been the man of the family?" Homer asked. James looked up sharply, not offended but startled by the directness. "Since my father died," he said. 8 months. That is a long time to be 14. James said nothing to this, but something in his face shifted, some small release like a knot loosening slightly. The other children came down in 1s and 2s over the next half hour, and Helen came last, her dark hair braided back, wearing a dress that had been dried overnight and was clean if not quite smooth. She looked rested in the cautious way of someone who had slept well for the first time in a while but was not yet sure whether to trust it. She saw Homer at the stove and stopped. "You cooked," she said. "I cook every morning," he said. "It is that or starve out here." Something at the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile but its precursor. "May I help?" "You can help with the children," he said. "I have got the stove." She stood for a moment watching him work, and then she sat down with the smaller children and began distributing plates with the calm efficiency of a woman who has fed many mouths for many years and has stopped finding it remarkable. Bo appeared at the back door with news about the wheel. It could be repaired, he said, but it would take most of the day. Homer told him to go ahead and fix it properly. He caught Helen's eyes across the table, and she was looking at him with a question she did not ask aloud, and he answered it the way it needed to be answered. "You are not in anyone's way," he said quietly. "The children can play in the barn if they want. I will have Rodrigo show them the horses." The sound that went around the table at the mention of horses was immediate and unanimous, and even James's careful face broke open briefly into something that looked startlingly like boyhood. That day passed with the gentle strangeness of an unexpected gift. The rain continued but softened to a drizzle by mid-morning, and the children moved between the house and the barn with increasing confidence, their voices carrying across the yard in the wet air. Homer worked at his desk on the account books he had been putting off, and he could hear them through the window, the high, bright sound of children who had been stressed and cold, and were now neither of those things. The 5-year-old Clara invented a game involving the barn cat, a piece of rope, and a complex set of rules that Homer could not follow from the window, but that seemed to satisfy her. The two middle boys, Thomas and William, followed Rodrigo around the barn with the fixed attention of disciples, asking questions in the rapid, overlapping way of boys that age, and Rodrigo, to his credit, answered every one of them without impatience. Helen spent the morning in the kitchen, and when Homer came in at noon, he found that she had cleaned everything, reorganized the shelves into a more logical order, and produced a pot of stew from the ingredients available that was substantially better than anything Homer had managed to cook for himself in recent memory. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen looking at it with an expression that he hoped did not reveal as much as it felt like it was revealing. "You did not have to do that," he said. "You gave us shelter and food and someone to fix our wagon," she said, stirring the pot without looking up. "Cleaning your kitchen is the smallest thing." "It is a better kitchen now," he admitted. "I did not know where I kept most of that." She did look up then, and there was the edge of a smile again, and this time it made it all the way. It transformed her face entirely, that smile, the way sudden sunlight transforms a landscape you thought you knew. Homer Ellsworth, who had spent 34 years being relatively unshaken by most things, felt completely ambushed by it. He sat down at the table and they talked while she finished the stew, and then while they ate. She told him about Kansas, about the early years of her marriage when the land had been good, and the weather had cooperated, and the future had looked solid. She told him about Daniel Crawford with the measured honesty of someone who loved a person clearly, including their flaws. Daniel had been a good man, she said, but not a careful one with money, and the combination of 2 bad drought years and a cattle price collapse had done what those things always did to men who built on hope more than margin. He had died before he saw the full extent of it, which she said was possibly a mercy. "Do you miss him?" Homer asked, and then immediately felt that the question was too direct, but she did not seem to mind it. She thought about it seriously, the way she seemed to do with everything. "I miss what we were building," she said. "And I miss having a partner, and I miss my children having a father." She paused. "And I miss him, yes, but I have had 8 months to do my grieving, and I have done most of it because I could not afford to do it slowly." Homer nodded. He understood that kind of grief, the kind that gets compressed by necessity. "What about you?" she asked. "You are alone out here." "I am," he said, "by choice." "By default," he said, and then corrected himself. "Or perhaps by choice. I am not always sure which." She looked at him with those clear dark eyes and said, "You seem like a man who knows his own mind." "On most things," he said, "not all things." That afternoon Homer walked the fence line to the south pasture with James at his side, having had a sense, the way you sometimes do, that the boy needed to be doing something useful. He showed James how to check the tension of a wire and how to spot a post that was going soft at the base. James listened carefully and asked good questions and did not pretend to know things he did not know, which Homer respected in a person of any age. "Do you like ranching?" Homer asked. "I think I might," James said. In the considered way he said everything. "I did not know enough about it to know back in Kansas. My father ran cattle, but he did not teach me much of the working of it." He paused. "I think he thought there would be more time." Homer said nothing to that because there was nothing to say. "You do most of this yourself?" James asked, looking out across the pasture. "Mostly," Homer said. "Rodrigo and Bo help, but it is my land, so it is my work." "I would like that," James said quietly, almost to himself, "to have something that was mine to work." Homer looked at the boy, this 14-year-old with the square shoulders and the old eyes, and he felt something he did not have a name for yet, something adjacent to the feeling he got when he saw Helen Crawford smile. By evening, Bo had the wheel repaired solid enough to make the 40 miles tomorrow without trouble, and the rain had stopped entirely, and the western sky had turned that particular deep orange and violet that the Texas panhandle produced in the evenings like a daily apology for everything else it put you through. Homer stood on his porch and watched it and heard the screen door open behind him and knew, without turning around, that it was Helen. She came and stood beside him, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her arm. She was looking at the sky, too. "We can leave in the morning," she said. "You can," he said. The Caldwell Creek crossing should be passable by sunrise. A silence opened between them that was full of things neither of them was saying yet. "I want to thank you," she said, "not just for the shelter and the wheel, for treating us like people." He turned to look at her. "What else would I treat you like?" She met his eyes, and her expression was complicated in a way that told him something about what the last 8 months had been. "You would be surprised," she said, "what some people think a widow with 6 children is." "A burden," he said, and she nodded once, the way you nod when someone names a thing you have been trying not to name. "You are not a burden," he said. "Not to me." She held his gaze for a moment longer than she might have, and then she looked back at the sky and said, "I know that. That is why I am thanking you." Homer turned back to the sky and stood there beside her in the quiet, and the day ended around them in its colors, and he thought that he had not felt this particular fullness in his chest in so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. In the morning he helped them load the wagon with the breakfast he had packed himself: cornbread wrapped in a cloth and dried meat, and 2 apples for each child. And the children said their goodbyes to Rodrigo and the barn cat, and the horses with the sincere grief of people who had briefly attached themselves to things and now had to let go. The 7-year-old William cried without embarrassment about leaving the horse he had named Captain over the course of a single day, and Rodrigo crouched down and told him with complete seriousness that Captain would remember him, which did not stop the crying but seemed to help it. Helen stood at the wagon and Homer stood beside it, and there was that same fullness of things unsaid between them. "I hope Morrow is good to you," he said. "I hope so too." She paused, her hand on the wagon. "I do not suppose we will be near each other again." 40 miles, he said. "That is not so far." She looked at him and he looked back, and something passed between them that was clear as a bell rung in a quiet room. Then she climbed up to the wagon seat and gathered the reins, and James took his place beside her, and the others settled into the wagon bed, and they went out through the gate and down the road that was still red and wet from 3 days of rain. Homer stood at his gate and watched them go until they were gone from sight. Then he went inside and stood in his kitchen, which was cleaner and more orderly than it had ever been, and which smelled faintly of Helen Crawford's cooking, and he thought, 40 miles. He went to the desk and started composing a letter that same day. The letter took him 3 drafts and most of the afternoon to write. Not because he was struggling to express himself, but because he wanted to say the right things, which required him to first figure out what the right things were. He was not a flowery man. He did not deal in poetry or elaborate language. But he was an honest man, and honest men can sometimes say in plain language what poets need entire stanzas for. He wrote that he had been glad of the company. He wrote that he hoped the road tomorrow had been easy. He wrote that he found himself thinking about the way she had managed those 6 children through something that would have broken a great many people, and that he respected it more than he knew how to say. He wrote that if she ever had reason to be back through the Dusty Creek area, he hoped she would stop. And then, after a long pause during which he stared at the bottom of the page, he wrote that he would like very much to write to her again if she was willing, and that she should tell him if she was not, and he would understand. He folded the letter and addressed it to Helen Crawford, care of her sister in Morrow, and he gave it to the mail rider when the man came through 4 days later. The reply came 3 weeks after that, and when Homer saw the handwriting on the envelope, he stood in the middle of the road where the mail rider had given it to him, and just held it for a moment before opening it. Her writing was clear and strong, slanting slightly to the right, the writing of someone who had been educated carefully and used that education every day. She wrote that she was grateful he had written. She wrote that Morrow was adequate, but that her brother-in-law was a man of rigid opinions about charity, which she said with a restraint that told Homer a great deal. She wrote that the children were managing, and that James had found work helping a local man with his horses, and that this was good for him. She wrote that Rose had a cold that she expected to resolve shortly. And then, at the end, she wrote that she would very much like to continue corresponding if he was sincere about it. Homer was sincere about it. They wrote to each other for 6 weeks. The letters became longer and more candid as the weeks passed, the way conversations do when you cannot see the other person's face, and therefore cannot use their expression to calibrate how much you are saying. He told her things about himself that he had not told most people, about the years on the cattle drives, about the way he had felt when he first stood on the land he had bought and understood it was his, about his mother, who had died when he was 19, and whom he still thought about with the specific ache of unfinished business, about the quality of loneliness that comes from choosing it and then no longer being certain you chose correctly. She told him about Daniel's last weeks and the peculiar guilt of grief that included relief, which she had not been able to say aloud to anyone in Kansas or Morrow because people misunderstood it. She told him about what it was like to be responsible for 6 people when you were not entirely sure you were capable of being responsible for yourself. She told him about the nights when she lay awake and calculated and recalculated and arrived at the same insufficient number every time. And she told him, with a kind of defiant honesty, that she was not looking to be rescued, that she had learned to be suspicious of the word rescue, but that she was desperately tired of being alone in the managing of things. Homer read this last part 3 times and then sat with it for a long while before writing back. He asked her directly if she would consider returning to Dusty Creek. Not to stay with him, he clarified, because he understood that would not be proper, and also that she had her pride and he respected it. But there were opportunities in Dusty Creek. There was a schoolhouse that needed a teacher, as it had been without one for 2 terms. There was a cottage near the main street that stood empty and was owned by old Marcus Webb, who Homer knew and could speak to on her behalf. Her children could be near a school, and James could find work, and she would not be beholden to a brother-in-law with rigid opinions about charity. He then added in the last paragraph that he was not proposing this arrangement purely out of altruism, and that he thought she was intelligent enough to know that, and that he was not going to pretend otherwise. He sent the letter and spent the next 10 days alternating between confidence that he had said exactly what needed to be said and the cold certainty that he had been too direct and had frightened her off. He occupied himself with the ranch with more than usual intensity during this period, putting in fence posts that did not strictly need replacing and re-roofing a section of the barn that was only mildly problematic, and Rodrigo watched him do this with the expression of a man who has seen this behavior before and finds it amusing but is too polite to say so. The reply came on a Tuesday morning, and Homer read it standing in his kitchen with his hat still on. She was writing, she said, to say two things. The first was yes, she would consider it, and she would very much like to speak with him about the teaching position before she made a decision. The second was that she appreciated him not pretending, and that she had grown very tired of pretending herself, and that this was possibly the most useful thing he had said in any of his letters. Homer smiled at that letter in a way he could not remember smiling at a piece of paper before. He arranged everything before she arrived. He spoke to the school board, which in Dusty Creek consisted of 3 men who ran the town's principal businesses and who were genuinely desperate for a teacher, and they were interested enough to offer Helen a position on the basis of Homer's recommendation, and a short letter she wrote at his request outlining her qualifications. He spoke to old Marcus Webb, who was in his 70s and ailing and quite happy to have someone occupy his cottage in exchange for a modest rent and the occasional meal, which Homer suspected Webb enjoyed more for the company than for the food. He had Bo and Rodrigo clean the cottage and stack firewood against the outside wall and replace the pump handle that had rusted through. When he told Rodrigo what he was doing, Rodrigo said, without preamble, "The woman from the rain." It was not a question. "Yes," Homer said. Rodrigo nodded with deep satisfaction and went back to what he was doing. Helen Crawford arrived in Dusty Creek on a clear October morning, 3 weeks after that letter, in the same battered wagon with the 6 children and the tired mule, though the wagon wheel was holding solidly now. Homer was at the edge of town when they came down the main street, not because he had planned to be there exactly, but because he had somehow ended up there. She saw him and pulled the wagon to a stop. The children, who had apparently been told about the circumstances of their relocation with sufficient detail to understand their implications, watched with various degrees of subtlety. James watched with the careful assessment of the oldest, his face giving nothing away but his eyes taking in everything. Clara, the 5-year-old, watched with no subtlety whatsoever, studying Homer with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to dissemble. Helen climbed down from the wagon. She was wearing a blue dress Homer had not seen before, and her dark hair was pinned up properly, and she looked the way he had remembered her looking, which was a relief, because memory has a way of improving or diminishing things, and he had been worried it had done one or the other. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Homer," he said. She smiled then, the full one, the one that transformed her face, and Homer felt it in his chest the way he had the first time. "Homer," she said. He showed them the cottage first. She walked through it with a careful, practical eye, looking at the hearth and the windows and the sleeping space with the measuring gaze of someone who had arranged and rearranged many households. The children spread through the cottage like water finding its level, exploring each room with their individual styles. William at a run, James at a slow, considered walk, Clara with the imperial air of a small person who is deciding whether something meets her standards. "It is good," Helen said finally, standing in the kitchen. She said it quietly, more to herself than to him, and he understood that she meant more than the cottage. They had supper together that evening at Homer's ranch, all 9 of them at the big kitchen table, which had never been used to such capacity, and which seemed to expand to the occasion. Rodrigo cooked because he had insisted, producing a meal of improbable quality from the ranch supplies, and they ate in the kind of noise and motion and overlapping conversation that a table of 8 people, including 5 children, naturally produces, and Homer sat at the head of his table and looked down the length of it, and thought that this was what the room had been missing. After supper, after the children were walked back to the cottage and settled for the night, after James had made his quiet rounds checking doors and windows in the unconscious way of a boy who had been the man of the family for 8 months, Homer and Helen stood on the porch of the cottage in the cool October dark. "This was generous," she said, "all of this." "I wanted to do it," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I need you to know that I am not here purely because it was offered. I am here because I wanted to come." Homer looked at her in the dim light from the cottage windows. "I know that too," he said. "I know you well enough from the letters." She turned toward him slightly, and he could see her face in the light, the dark eyes that had looked at him steadily through the rain 5 weeks ago and had looked at him steadily through every letter since. "Then you know," she said, "that I am not a woman who does things for simple reasons." "I know that," he said. "I am glad for it." They were standing very close together on the small porch, closer than the space required, and Homer was aware of it and he thought she was too, and neither of them moved away. "I should go inside," she said, not moving. "Yes," he said, not moving either. After a moment she said very quietly, "Homer." "Helen," he said. And then she was the one who reached out, her hand finding his arm in the dark, her fingers curling around it for just a moment with a grip that was surprisingly strong, the grip of a woman who was accustomed to holding on to things she meant to keep. Then she let go and went inside, and Homer walked back to his ranch in the dark with his hands in his pockets and his heart doing something unprecedented and undignified in his chest. The weeks that followed were the most particular weeks of Homer Ellsworth's life. Helen began teaching at the schoolhouse, which she took to with an energy and purpose that the town found impressive. She was strict and fair and genuinely interested in what her students knew and did not know, and within a month she had the school running on a schedule that the parents of Dusty Creek, most of whom had been concerned primarily with whether someone would just show up, found unexpectedly excellent. The children of the town responded to her the way children respond to adults who take them seriously, which is with a loyalty bordering on devotion. Her own 6 children settled into Dusty Creek with the adaptability of people who had already been through significant disruption and had developed certain survival skills as a result. James found steady work at the livery stable, which was run by a man named Perry Hatch, who recognized quality when it turned up asking for work. Thomas and William were enrolled in Helen's school alongside the town children, where they made friends with the competitive efficiency of 9- and 7-year-olds who understand that social hierarchy reassembles itself quickly and should be engaged with urgency. Martha was old enough to help at the cottage and to assist Helen on weekends, which she did with a responsibility that made her seem older than 12. Clara conducted her daily life with the self-contained confidence she had apparently been born with. And Rose continued to watch everything with those enormous eyes and make occasional observations of such startling accuracy that everyone who heard them tended to stop and look at her. Homer came by the cottage most evenings, ostensibly for various practical reasons, and no one in Dusty Creek was deceived by the practicality of his reasons, but no one said so in an unkind way, because Homer Ellsworth was known in town as a good man, and Helen Crawford had come through the gate in the rain and earned her own position in the town's opinion by being competent and dignified, and by producing 6 children who behaved themselves in public. He and Helen fell into the habit of sitting on her porch after the children were in bed, sometimes talking and sometimes sitting in a comfortable silence, which was, Homer thought, the better kind of intimacy. He was learning her the way you learn a piece of land you intend to keep, carefully and over time, attending to the places where the ground was uncertain and to the places where it was absolutely solid. He learned that she was funny in a dry, understated way that you could miss if you were not paying attention. He learned that she held her grief about her husband not as a wound anymore, but as a part of herself that she had incorporated, like the way a healed bone is sometimes stronger than the original. He learned that she was deeply suspicious of dependence but desperately wanted partnership, and that she was working on understanding that these two things were not mutually exclusive. She was learning him too. He could tell by the way she asked questions, thoughtful questions that circled around the thing she actually wanted to know before arriving at it. She wanted to know why he had never married. She wanted to know what he was afraid of. She wanted to know if the ranch was all he had wanted his life to be, and if it was not, what else there was. He answered her honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer things, and her face changed slightly each time he answered, in a way that made him think she was revising a picture of him she had been drawing in her head. One evening in November, when the first real cold of the Texas winter had come down, and they were sitting closer together on the porch than they usually did because the air had taken a sharp edge, he said what he had been building toward for weeks. "I love you," he said. "I realize this is likely too soon by most people's reckoning. I am telling you because I would rather you know it directly than guess at it, and because I think you are a woman who prefers directness." Helen turned her head and looked at him. She did not look surprised exactly, but she looked as though hearing it said aloud was different from knowing it, which he supposed it was. "It is too soon," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been a widow for 9 months. I know that too." She was quiet for a long while. The cold air moved between them, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the cottage chimney. "Homer," she said finally, "I have been in love with you since the morning you gave James coffee and asked him how long he had been the man of the family." He turned and looked at her. "I did not want to be," she said. "I thought it was too quick, and I thought you were probably going to turn out to be something disappointing on closer examination, the way things often do. But you did not turn out to be disappointing." She paused. "It is inconvenient." He laughed, a short, genuine sound that startled them both. "I am sorry for the inconvenience," he said. She smiled at him. "No, you are not." "No," he agreed. "I am not." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there in the cold evening with their hands together, and the stars coming out above the panhandle in their extravagant winter numbers. And Homer Ellsworth thought that he had been right to keep waiting, even when he had not known what he was waiting for. The courtship that followed was conducted with the deliberate patience of two people who had both learned the cost of rushing. Homer came to Sunday dinner at the cottage every week, and they took walks together along the edge of town on the evenings when the weather permitted, and he met her at the schoolhouse on the days he was in town on ranch business, and she visited the ranch on Saturdays with the children, who had by now formed their own relationships with Rodrigo and Bo, and the horses that were entirely independent of whatever was happening between their mother and Homer. The town of Dusty Creek watched all of this with the focused interest that small towns bring to their romantic narratives, and the consensus was that it was time, and that Helen Crawford and Homer Ellsworth were the right people, and that those 6 children deserved a proper household, and that Homer had been alone on that ranch for long enough. The consensus was not wrong about any of these things, which is not always the case. There was one complication that presented itself in December, and it came in the form of a man named Gideon Wells, who ran a dry goods store in Dusty Creek, and who had been cultivating an interest in Helen Crawford since her arrival in town. Gideon was not a bad man, but he was a persistent one, and he had the particular confidence of a man who owns his own business in a small town and is accustomed to having that counted in his favor. He had brought Helen supplies on credit terms that were notably more favorable than what he offered other customers, and he had made his intentions clear in the opaque but unmistakable way of men who are not quite brave enough to say a thing directly. Helen had been clear with Gideon Wells in the way she was clear about everything, which was to say fully and without ambiguity, and he had retreated but not entirely surrendered. He made a point of being present when Homer was, and of finding occasion to speak to Helen in public in ways designed to establish a kind of familiarity, and Homer watched this with the calm attention of a man who is confident but not oblivious. One afternoon at the general store, with several townspeople present, Gideon said to Helen, within Homer's hearing, that he hoped she knew she had options in Dusty Creek, and that a woman in her position should not feel compelled to accept the first arrangement that presented itself. The silence that followed this was considerable. Helen turned from the shelf she had been examining and looked at Gideon Wells with an expression that Homer would later describe as the look of a woman deciding which of several possible responses to use, and selecting the most lethal for its economy. "Mr. Wells," she said, with perfect composure, I have managed 6 children alone through a foreclosure, 3 days of rain, and 4 months of my brother-in-law's hospitality. I am not compelled to do anything, and I am quite capable of deciding my own affairs. I thank you for the sentiment." And she turned back to the shelf. Homer, who had been standing behind the flour barrel, experienced a surge of something that was indistinguishable from admiration, and had several other things mixed into it. He caught Gideon Wells's eye across the store with the steady look of a man who is not angry but who is also finished with a subject, and Wells nodded once and found reason to be somewhere else. Homer proposed to Helen Crawford on a Saturday in January of 1879, at the ranch, after the children had been sent on various invented errands by Rodrigo, who had been informed of the plan and had organized the logistics with military precision. Homer and Helen were sitting in the kitchen, which had long since become their kitchen in any way that mattered, and he had made coffee, and they were talking about the spring planting calendar with the easy intimacy of people who have been sharing a life in all its practical dimensions, and he stopped mid-sentence and said, "Helen, will you marry me?" It was not a question, exactly, in the way he said it. It was more like a statement of what was already true that needed acknowledging. She put down her cup and looked at him with those dark eyes, and in them he saw everything she felt, the love that she had been carrying since November, the fear that was still there because it was reasonable to be afraid of wanting something this much, the tiredness of being alone that made the fear seem like a price worth paying, and underneath all of it, solid and undeniable as a fence post properly driven, the certainty. "Yes," she said, "I will." He took both her hands across the table and they sat there for a moment in the warmth of the kitchen, and then she said, "James is going to want to speak to you. He has thought himself the head of this family for 8 months and he is not going to simply cede the position without a conversation." "I know," Homer said. "I was going to speak to him this afternoon." She looked at him. "You have already thought about this." "I have thought about very little else for 2 months," he said honestly. She squeezed his hands and smiled at him, and it was the full smile, the one that started at her eyes, and Homer Ellsworth thought he would spend whatever years he had left trying to be worthy of it. The conversation with James happened that same afternoon. The boy came into the kitchen with his square shoulders and his careful eyes, and Homer told him plainly that he loved Helen and intended to marry her, and that he understood James had been looking after the family and that Homer had no intention of replacing him or diminishing what he had done. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My father was a good man." "I believe you," Homer said. "This is different from replacing him," James said, as if working it out. "Completely different," Homer said. "I am not trying to be your father. I am asking to be your family." James looked at him steadily. Then he nodded, the controlled nod of a boy who is trying very hard not to show that something has affected him, but who has been affected by it completely. "She has been tired," James said quietly, "for a long time. I am glad she is going to stop being tired." Homer had to look away for a moment. They were married in March of 1879 at the Dusty Creek Community Church, which was a small white-painted building that held the town's population of about 200 with some crowding, and which was in fact crowded that Saturday because the town had decided collectively that this was an occasion that warranted showing up for. The preacher was a tall man named Reverend Sims, who had been in the Panhandle for 15 years, and had the weathered certainty of a man whose faith has been tested by the landscape and survived. Helen wore a dress of deep blue wool that Martha had helped her make over the previous 2 weeks, and her dark hair was pinned up with small white flowers that Clara had insisted on, and she walked down the aisle on James's arm, because she had asked him to give her away, and because James had stood straight and solemn and proud in a way that made half the women in the pews find their handkerchiefs. Homer stood at the front of the church with Rodrigo beside him, because he had no family to stand up with him, and Rodrigo was the closest thing, and Rodrigo was wearing a clean shirt and an expression of profound satisfaction that he was not attempting to conceal. Bo was there too, in the third pew, having combed his hair to a smoothness that made him look barely recognizable, and he was the first one on his feet when the preacher said they were married. Homer kissed his wife in front of the entire assembled town of Dusty Creek, and she kissed him back, and someone in the back pews cheered, which was not strictly the done thing in a church but which nobody seemed to mind. The reception afterward was held at the community hall and ran well into the evening, because this was the kind of town where a good reason to celebrate was not wasted. There was music from 2 fiddles and a man with a harmonica who was technically not as good as the fiddle players, but who had enough enthusiasm to make up the difference. Homer danced with Helen to every song that could be danced to, even the ones he did not know well, because she was laughing when they danced and he was not inclined to stop that for anything. He danced with Clara too, who took the occasion with great seriousness and corrected his footwork twice. He danced, briefly and with significant comedy, with Rose, who had to stand on his boots to participate and who thought this was the greatest thing that had ever happened to her. James did not dance, but he stood at the edge of the room with a glass of cider and watched everything with a face that had lost its careful quality for one evening and was simply, unambiguously happy. The family moved into the ranch house in April. This was a production that involved the reorganization of most of the ranch's domestic arrangements, and which Homer approached with the good sense to accept that Helen would be the one reorganizing them, and that his job was primarily to carry things and agree. She made the house a home in the way that she made everything, efficiently and without waste, but with a warmth in the details that changed the quality of every room. She put curtains on the windows. She planted a kitchen garden behind the house. She moved the furniture so that the main room could accommodate all 8 of them in the evenings, and she put a second table in the kitchen because the first one was not adequate for the population. The children spread through the ranch like they had been born to it. James took on real responsibilities at Homer's side, learning the work of cattle ranching with the same careful focus he brought to everything. And Homer taught him everything he knew, not holding anything back, because the boy was going to need it someday, and there was no point in hoarding knowledge. Thomas and William became the absolute province of the horses, spending every free hour in the barn, and Perry Hatch at the livery started asking specifically for William when he had a horse that needed gentle handling, which William accepted with the solemnity of a professional acknowledgement. Martha was 14 now, and had the kind of reliable competence that is rare in people of any age. Clara remained Clara, self-possessed and observant, with a capacity for friendship that drew other children to her like a magnet. And Rose grew and talked constantly, and followed Homer around the ranch with an attachment that he found alternately touching and slightly overwhelming, and which he would not have changed for anything. Homer and Helen were, by any measure, happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of people who have never suffered, which does not survive much contact with reality, but the deeper and more durable happiness of people who have come to something good by way of difficult roads, and who know what it cost and are grateful accordingly. They argued occasionally, because they were both direct people with strong views, and 2 direct people with strong views will occasionally find their views in collision, but they argued the way people argue when they respect each other, which is to say with honesty rather than strategy, and they resolved things cleanly and without remainder. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch the way they had sat on the cottage porch in the months of the courtship, and they talked or did not talk, and Homer thought sometimes about the woman who had appeared at his gate in the rain, soaked through and dignified and entirely at the end of her resources, and he thought about how he had opened that gate without hesitation, not knowing who she was, not knowing what she was about to become to him. Simply knowing that a woman with 6 children in the rain required a gate to be opened, and that was all the reason he had needed. He said this to Helen once, on a summer evening when the air was soft and the stars were beginning, and she was quiet for a moment. "You know what I thought when you opened that gate," she said. "What?" "I thought, this man is either extraordinarily kind or extraordinarily foolish, and I did not particularly care which, because my wheel was failing and my children were cold." He laughed. "Which did you decide I was?" She turned and looked at him in the dark, and her expression was so full of warmth that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "I decided you were both," she said, "and that I was very lucky either way." By the following spring, in 1880, Helen was expecting their first child together. She told Homer on a March morning in the kitchen, in the same direct way she told him everything, and he stood at the stove with the coffee pot in his hand and looked at her, and the expression on his face was apparently remarkable enough that she said, with the dry humor he loved, "You might want to put that down before you drop it." He put it down and crossed to her and took her face in his hands and kissed her, which she returned warmly. And then Clara came in from the back room and looked at them with 3 seconds of assessment and said, "Is there a baby coming?" Helen pulled back and looked at her youngest surviving daughter. "How do you always know things?" she said. Clara shrugged with the equanimity of someone for whom this is just how things are. The child was born in October of 1880 in the bedroom of the ranch house, on a cool autumn evening with Rodrigo anxiously circling the barn outside, and the older children in a state of elaborate pretend calm in the kitchen. He was a boy. Homer stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at this new person, this son, and felt something so large it required him to sit down on the edge of the bed, which he did. And Helen watched him from the pillow with the knowing eyes of a woman who has done this before, and is pleased to see a man undone by it for the first time. They named him Daniel, which Homer suggested because it was right, and Helen looked at him when he said it with an expression that resolved something that had been quietly unresolved in her face since Homer had known her, and she said yes, that was exactly the right name. James came in to see his new brother and stood over the cradle with the careful face he always wore, and then he looked up at Homer with an expression that was more open than any Homer had seen from him. "I have been thinking," James said, with the gravity of a 16-year-old who has been thinking seriously. "If it would be all right with you, I would like to use Ellsworth for my name." The kitchen was very quiet. Homer stood there and looked at this boy who was not his son by blood, but who was his son by every measure that Homer found important, and he said, "James, I would be honored." James nodded, the controlled nod, but his eyes were bright and he looked away, and Homer looked away too, and they were both looking at the baby in the cradle, and that was all that needed to happen. Daniel Crawford Ellsworth turned out to be a solid, cheerful child with Helen's dark eyes and Homer's broad-shouldered build already evident in miniature, who met the world with an uncomplicated enthusiasm that delighted everyone around him. He had 6 siblings who collectively ensured he was never short of company, attention, or someone to follow, and he responded to this abundance by being easygoing and affectionate in the way that children are who have always been surrounded by love and see no reason to be guarded about it. The ranch expanded over the following years in the quiet, steady way that successful ranches do when they are properly worked. Homer bought the southern pasture from an aging neighbor who was returning east in 1881, and he and James fenced and managed it together, and the cattle herd grew. Thomas, at 13, turned out to have a natural aptitude for the business side of ranching that neither Homer nor James had, and he began keeping the account books with a meticulousness that Homer found genuinely impressive. William continued his singular devotion to horses, and by 15 had a reputation in 3 counties as someone to consult when a horse had a problem, which Perry Hatch took equal parts pride in and credit for. Martha married at 20 to a man who ran the post office in Dusty Creek, and who treated her with the consistent respect she had been quietly requiring from the world her entire life. Clara continued to be Clara, gathering people around her with the effortless magnetism of someone who genuinely loves the company of others, and making friends at a rate that Homer suspected she would maintain for the rest of her life. Rose grew up bookish and precise, with her mother's clear-eyed intelligence and her father's quiet watchfulness. And at 16, she was already helping at the schoolhouse in a way that made Helen predict, correctly as it turned out, that she would be a teacher. Rodrigo was still at the ranch in 1882, though his hair was going silver, and he had taken to sitting on the fence rather than going over it. He had become, without anyone formally deciding this, a kind of permanent member of the household, a figure of authority with the younger children that existed parallel to and wholly compatible with Homer's own. When baby Daniel took his first steps, it was toward Rodrigo, who was sitting on the kitchen floor for the express purpose of providing a destination, and who received this first milestone with the solemnity and pride of a godfather, which was essentially what he was. Beau had eventually moved on, as was his way, heading further west in 1881, with a vague plan that probably involved machinery. He left a note that was characteristically brief and entirely warm, and Homer kept it in the desk. Homer and Helen took walks in the evenings when the ranch work was done, and the children were occupied, the way they always had, and they talked about things the way they always had, with the easy fullness of people who have the whole of the other person's confidence. They talked about the children, about the ranch, about the world that was changing around them even out here in the Panhandle, the railroad coming through 30 miles to the south, and the town of Dusty Creek growing and shifting accordingly. They talked about serious things and small things with equal attention, because they had both learned that the small things, the real texture of daily life, are often the more important ones. On a September evening in 1882, sitting on the porch in the warmth of a late-season sun, with the sounds of the house behind them and the wide Texas sky in front, Helen said to Homer, in a tone of particular contentment, "Do you remember what you told me the night we sat on the cottage porch? About waiting and not being sure you had chosen it or it had chosen you." "I remember," he said. "I have been thinking about that lately," she said. "About waiting. I did not think I was waiting for anything when I came down that road. I thought I was just trying to get tomorrow." "You were," he said. "But I was also waiting," she said. "I just did not know it." She paused, looking at the sky. "I think that is how it works. You are waiting for something and you do not recognize it until you see it, and then you cannot imagine how you did not know what you were looking for all along." Homer looked at her profile against the evening light. She was 35 years old, and she was beautiful in the way that people become beautiful when they are fully themselves, which is the best kind, the kind that deepens rather than diminishes. "I opened a gate," he said, "and everything came in." She turned her head and looked at him with those dark eyes that he had been looking into for 4 years now, and which still did things to him that he had no words for. "Everything came in," she agreed softly. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat together on the porch of the ranch they shared, with the house full of their children and the land spread out before them in the golden Texas evening, and the stars beginning their slow appearance in the east. And Homer Ellsworth thought, with the deep and grounded certainty of a man who has found exactly what he did not know he was looking for, that every single step of his life had been heading here to this porch, to this woman leaning against his shoulder, to the sound of 6 children and one brand-new 7th life filling the rooms behind them. He had not hesitated the day he opened the gate. He had not hesitated on any of the days since, and the world had opened up for him in exactly the way that the world opens for people who do not hesitate when it matters. Later, when the stars were fully out and the house had gone quiet and they were still sitting in the dark because neither of them was ready to go inside and end the evening, Homer said, "I am going to need a bigger porch." Helen laughed, the full, warm laugh that he loved as much as the smile, and she said, "Yes, I expect you are." He pressed a kiss to her hair, and she held the hand that rested on her shoulder, and the night settled around them, full and complete, like a story that knows exactly where to end. The porch was built the following spring. Homer and James built it together over 3 weekends, measuring and cutting with the focused companionship that had grown between them over 4 years into something that was its own kind of love, different from but not lesser than any other kind. It wrapped around the entire front of the house and part of the south side, and it was wide enough for a rocking chair and a bench and room between them to walk. And on the evening they finished it, every member of the household came out and stood on it and tested it with the collective weight of 10 people, which it held without complaint. Helen stood at the center of the new porch and looked out at the land and the sky and the gate at the end of the road, and Homer stood beside her, and the children ranged around them in their various ways, and Rose, who was 11 now and had her mother's habit of saying the precise thing, said, "It is a good porch." "It is," Homer agreed. "Big enough for everything," Rose said. He looked at Helen and she looked back at him, and they both knew that this was true and had been true for years now. It was big enough for everything they had brought through the gate together, big enough for every child and every year and every evening ahead of them, big enough for a life they had built from a woman standing in the rain and a man who had opened his gate before he even knew why. He had not hesitated once, and he never would.